We do want to begin with what to expect from the throne speech, where the government will unveil its plan for an economic recovery. The Prime Minister says he'll be asking Canadians to embark on a, quote, entirely different direction, and the opposition will have to make a choice about whether to support that. The CBC's National Affairs editor, Chris Hall, has been talking to people inside Liberal caucus to figure out what the plan will look like, and he has some new details for us. Hi, Chris. Good to see you.
You too, Vashi.
So, look, we're 20 days away from the throne speech. We know that the government, the Prime Minister, in fact, has said he's characterized it as them laying out what he says is an ambitious vision. When you're talking to people about what that vision may look like, what are you hearing? And in particular, how much money do you think the government is prepared to spend, I guess, in that vein?
Well, look, what he's talking about are things that came up during the pandemic that they realized were systemic problems, including inequality of access to health care in some communities, long-term care centers, concerns about childcare for women who had to make choices between going to work or finding a place for their child to be cared for properly. So all of these are really big ticket items. What I found from talking to people over the last couple of days is that the normal kind of mechanisms that are put in place to ensure you don't spend too much. So, for example, how deeply in deficit can you go? The debt-to-GDP ratio, which we know is how Bill Morneau always measured how much spending the government could tolerate. These kind of fiscal anchors, as the economists call them, will not be part of the equation. They're determined, I'm told, to spend what it takes. There's an opportunity here with low interest rates, and since almost every other country in the world is also struggling to emerge from the economic lockdowns that were caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, that they are prepared to do what it takes. They are prepared to spend as much as it takes, absent those usual constraints about how much will it cost, can we return to balance within a set time period, the normal kinds of fiscal anchors that are usually put in place.
There was some reporting prior to Bill Morneau's resignation around his own pushback against that and sort of, deficits with abandon. Is there any pushback inside the Liberal caucus around what you just described?
Well, that's interesting. The people that I talk to, most are in favor of the kinds of spending they're talking about. They don't get into the amounts because, frankly, most of them really don't understand if you're already $343 billion in deficit. What does it matter if you add a few $100 billion more? That's kind of the sense I got from some of them. On occasion, there are those who say, look, there has to be a path to return to balance. There has to be some way to measure that we are not overspending, that we aren't going beyond what the economy can bear when it recovers fully. Is it possible to absorb all of this? So the sense is that, yes, we need to do these things. They're particularly, in talking to various caucus members and others, sensitive to needing to do something about systemic racism, particularly in policing, which didn't emerge from the pandemic, but has emerged obviously since then as an issue both in this country and in the United States. So there's a willingness to spend, but especially with the longer term MPs, some concern about can we actually afford to do this down the road? Yes, interest rates are low, and yes, there's an opportunity here, but we have to be mindful of that bigger picture.
What about the politics of it? I'm interested in your take on sort of what positioning this puts other parties in, and especially the context around the possibility of an election.
Yeah, isn't it interesting? We hear cabinet ministers and others saying, we don't want an election. We want to get this agenda out to Canadians as the things that they care about addressing the concerns brought about by COVID-19. And then you listen to the Prime Minister talking to our colleague Stephen Quinn in Vancouver yesterday, where he says, oh, yes, if they have a different vision, the opposition party should have a right to vote on this. So my sense is that nobody is pushing for an election, but nobody's shying away from it either inside Liberal circles. And certainly, if you talk to David Hurley, for example, who'll be on the House this weekend, he thinks the timing is perfect right now because people are alive to the kinds of challenges the country faces and want them fixed. So I guess it all comes down to, can the NDP buy into what the vision is that the Liberals are going to put forward in that throne speech on September the 23rd? That will be a confidence matter, as you know. Or is there likely to be something in there, a poison pill, that might make it difficult for Jagmeet Singh to say, I can go along with this? Those are the things that we're still trying to weigh. It's not clear exactly how they will ultimately resolve this. I do know they're reaching out to labor unions, they're reaching out to business groups, they're talking to their own backbench MPs in a way they really haven't done in the first 4 years when they had a majority government. So I think that it's possible that it could happen. And certainly some people are suggesting the timing isn't all that bad, despite the pandemic, to go to the polls now.
All right. Thanks, Chris. You wrote a great piece on this. I urge everyone watching to check it out online.
Thanks, Tashi.
That's the CBC's National Affairs editor, Chris Hall. Picking up on Chris's point about the election, the Prime Minister made it clear again this morning in an interview that the onus, he says, will be on parliamentarians on September 23rd. They will decide whether Canadians head back to the polls. Have a listen to the Prime Minister's words.
It is the responsible and democratic thing to lay out that vision in a throne speech that Parliament will then vote on. It will be a confidence vote where we will be able to see whether this government's ambitious plan for the future and investing in Canadians has the support of Parliament.
For more analysis on the political strategy and possible repercussions of a confidence vote on the throne speech, the Power Panel is here in Denham, Quebec tonight. David Hurley, partner in the Gandalf Group and host of the Hurley Burley podcast. Jenny Byrne, former top staffer to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Ontario Premier Doug Ford, now a principal at Jenny Byrne and Associates, is with us from Toronto, as is Andrew Thompson, Chief of Government Relations for University of Toronto, former Saskatchewan Finance Minister as well. And over in Montreal, Emily Nicolas is a columnist with Le Devoir and co-founder of Quebec Inclusive. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Good to see you. Chris Hall says, if you speak to David Hurley, and Chris Hall's wish is my command, apparently. So, David, good to see you again. And Jenny, both of us were, the three of us were talking about this last night. I want to start with you. What sort of jumped out at me again was the Prime Minister again sort of doubling down on this is going to be a very specific vision that goes beyond what we articulated in the last election and sort of positioning it as a real point of distinction between the Liberals and other parties, thereby kind of creating some runway for the possibility of an election. How concerted do you think that effort is on the part of the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, this is a very interesting exercise in expectations management around this throne speech in that there isn't any. They are letting expectations run, and they are themselves fueling expectations about this. So they must have something really big in store that they think is going to live up to the expectations that they are letting run out there. The reality is that this is their platform electorally. In addition to being substance, I'm not diminishing it. I'm optimistic and hopeful that this is going to address a lot of the issues that Chris was talking about. But it is also an election platform because whether the election's this fall or whether it's next spring or even a year from now, this has to be what they're running on. It's not like you're going to have a platform that's going to be going to take this a whole lot further. Mm-hmm. They're talking about taking the country in a fundamentally different direction. And I think that sets them up. It is going to be their platform whenever it happens, but I think it sets them up very nicely for a very strong cleavage right now with the Conservatives.
Strategically, Jenny, that kind of leads me straight to you. What does that, I mean, how does that position the Conservatives, but even the NDP to an extent as well, right? Because the Liberals would have to be relying somewhat on their support or maybe from the Bloc, but likely the NDP to get this throne speech through. But as Chris said, they could put sort of a poison pill in there that forces an election as well.
Well, I think in terms of whether the NDP will support the speech from the throne, I think it's going to, for them, depend on how ready they could be to fight a campaign. They lost significant seats in the last election, despite the spin that they actually won seats, and they're not in a very good financial position. I do agree with David. I think that this speech from the throne is a campaign kickoff. I think that the Liberals want to go now, and I think that every day, increasingly, I think if I was a Liberal, I would want to have an election now. The last few days, the stock markets have taken a hit, and the reports about government spending in terms of the fact that in the quarter of COVID, Canadians lost $21 billion in employment compensation, but households received $54 billion in government transfers. So I think that they're going to want to go before the economy continues to take a hit over the course of the fall. They're going to want that behind them after this election.
Andrew, what does your gut tell you about that possibility?
I do think that the Liberals are looking for an opportunity to go now before the chickens come home to roost on what they've done. They've managed to do what would seem to be, I don't want to say the bare minimum, but it has certainly met Canadians' expectations of what needed to be done going into the pandemic. I don't know if they've exactly exceeded them. But they are going to want to be able to go out on that type of platform. And they're certainly going to want to campaign before they have to do any more explaining about what the longer-term vision is. A lot of the files that have been referenced have been sitting on their desks for 5 years, and there's been no action on it. We've seen no action on the question of anti-Black racism, despite the Prime Minister taking a knee 3 months ago on this. So there are a lot of issues. Expectations are building. To Jenny's point, my sense is that the NDP is ready to go to an election. They've done a good job fundraising over the last few months, and I think are prepared to go to it. But I don't get the sense that there's any great desire by any of the opposition parties right now to force an election, since Parliament seems to be working generally well. The question will be whether the Liberals see a political opportunity that they want to take advantage of.
Yeah, Emily, the interesting thing is, and we've been listening to this for a few days now, even the Prime Minister in laying out what he says the stakes are for the throne speech, or the opposition, Aaron O'Toole asked many times about the possibility of an election. Everyone's saying, we don't want it. We don't want it. Don't worry, we understand Canadians don't want an election. But the truth is, if the political opportunity arises, I'd be surprised, and maybe it won't be just the Liberals, but I'd be surprised if they didn't at least think about taking advantage of that.
Yeah, and it depends how you define the political opportunity, because the thing is, with back to school, there's a lot of frustrations. There's a lot of Canadians who are just, very much focused on what's going on in schools. Will the schools be forced to close down again? And if you start to have some outbreaks in major part of the cities of the country, I really doubt then an election this fall is going to sound wise. You can never know actually how much when second wave can start hitting back up hard. And so it makes it actually very speculative to know whether even 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now is going to be a good time for an election to be started. The one thing that it's also important to notice is that in terms of the NDP and the Liberal Party, it's not just, as Justice Trudeau was saying, we're going to see what the opposition is going to say. It's very likely that there's ongoing negotiation, parlays happening in terms of what, I know that the NDP as well had a couple of points of things that were non-negotiable for them in terms of what they would like to see in the throne speech. And so those conversations are probably very much ongoing. And so if the Liberals want to win their throne speech, they will have a clear sense of what is needed to be in there actually to have that confidence vote. And so if they don't want that, if they want to lose, they'll sabotage basically those parties with the NDP. But it seems very likely that they could actually reach an agreement.
Beyond Parliament, David, if we are looking at the throne speech as sort of the kickoff to a campaign, or what we can expect from a platform for the Liberals, you heard Chris's details around, for example, green programs, things of that nature. Who are they trying to reach? Like, what is the constituency or the constituencies that the Liberals will be aiming to reach through whatever new things that they decide to unveil during this speech?
Well, I think they're going to continue to want to speak to the urban and suburban constituencies of the country that are largely pushing a more progressive activist agenda. It feels to me like an election this fall would be a little bit of a game of chicken in a way, or whenever it happens, it might be a little bit of a game of chicken, because the polling that I'm doing is illustrating two things. One of it is that there's been a large shift in the public toward what the government's talking about in the throne speech, that people want a more activist approach out of government, and they've seen a number of fissures in society, a number of problems that they'd like addressed. So that desire for activism on a number of fronts exists. At the same time, people have never seen deficit numbers like $350 billion before, and they are shocked by them. And so there is unusually high concern about the debt and deficit levels in the country. So that's the yin and yang of Canadian politics right now. And, the one thing as a Liberal that Chris said that really disturbed me would be that they wouldn't have a fiscal anchor in there. Because I haven't had an economist, I've had a chance to talk to a number of economists on the hurly-burly, and I haven't had one that didn't in one way or another say that that would be something reckless to do.
So if, Jenny, do you accept, I guess, the characterization of the yin and yang, that there is an appetite for the government to play a role in whatever the recovery looks like, or to help Canadians through what has been obviously a really difficult time, but at the same time, there is, a sense of, wow, that's a big number, and there needs to be some sort of responsibility in that area. And if you accept that, how do you think the Conservatives address it?
Well, I think the Conservatives are working on their plan now in terms of addressing the the current challenges the Canadians are facing, as well as a long-term fiscal plan. I think that right now, in terms of the activism, it is purely political for the Liberals. I'm sure their polling is showing the same thing that David's polling is, and some of the stuff that we've seen federally. I think that part of the conversation that Trudeau has had in terms of talking about green energy and green economy, I think that is aimed at urban and suburban voters, but especially in Quebec. There was a lot of talk after the last election among Liberals that they felt that they lost ground in Quebec because they were seen as too pro-oil sands, for example. And so I think that they're making the determination that they're not going to pick up any seats in the West, so they need to pick up seats in Ontario and Quebec.
Emily, do you think if the green agenda or the green part of the throne speech is directed in some part towards Quebec, do you think it will have resonance there? I mean, it obviously. I preface that by saying it obviously depends on the content of it, but in theory, yes. Is that idea something that could have resonance in Quebec?
It's definitely something that is a wedge issue and very much a deal breaker, especially when it comes to pipelines, oil policies. It's also interesting to note who Justin Trudeau would be mainly running against in Quebec, which is the Bloc Québécois leader, who's a former Minister of Environment in the PQ. And there's actually a lot of conversations happening now because when he was an Environment Minister, he approved a project of an industry in Gaspésie that's actually very polluting. So his former record as environmental minister is actually under scrutiny right now. And so I think it would be interesting to see whether or not the Bloc leader could present himself as more green than the Liberals. One thing also that could help is that Stephen Guilbeault, who was elected in Montreal as somebody who could be a star environmental minister, who's been basically sitting at Heritage, which is something completely out of his realm of natural, strengths. And so if he was to be put, I think, in the environment, it would send a strong signal that actually the Liberals want to be green, at least for a little while.
Andrew, building on what your three co-panelists have said, especially when it comes to, for example, setting out, quote unquote, more activist agenda, conventional punditry would say that's going to eat the NDP's lunch, right? That is, the goal for at least electorally or strategically for the Liberals. We have some new information today, for example, around the wage subsidy that shows the Conservatives have decided to pay it back. That's what they used to help out during the pandemic with their party. The Liberals are going to stop taking it at the end of August. The NDP will continue taking it. Tell me, I guess, from your vantage point, how well positioned the NDP is to fight back against, if in fact that is the case, the Liberals trying to eat their lunch.
Well, I do think they're in a pretty good position. I mean, most of what the Liberals are going to present as having been accomplished during this last Parliament, during the current Parliament, has really been initiated by the NDP and driven by the NDP. And I think that the NDP feels pretty comfortable about being able to campaign on that. What I sense is happening, though, is that the Liberals are wanting to set this up as a battle between a progressive, pro-spending agenda, drawing the Conservatives into a default position where they will argue austerity and cuts to get back to some kind of a balanced budget. That's the binary choice that I think the Liberals are going to want to put before the electorate, figuring it'll squeeze the NDP and the Bloc out. The problem is I don't think that's going to work. For two reasons. One, I don't think the Conservatives are stupid enough to fall for that. I think that they will want to reframe this around a question of all parties want to see growth. What type of growth are we going to have? Something that requires a leap of faith into the so-called green economy, or something that actually builds on the traditional strengths of our economy where we know that there's an ability to create jobs. And I think that this question of jobs is really what's going to come down into Canadians' minds. This is a huge problem right now in our country that we're just not talking a lot about. There are, 14, 15, 17% of Canadians with no work. So the question about what needs to be in place to support them, not just in terms of fantasy projects down the road that move us into a green economy, but what today can be done to get these working folks back into income earning roles, what can be done to get the economy growing, and what can be done to make sure that there's actually job growth that goes with that. That, I think, is really what's sitting in Canadians' minds, as opposed to the question of, is it green, is it not, which we kind of talked about the last time, or, is this a borrow and spend platform from the Liberals, or is it an austerity approach from the Conservatives? So I just think that, the simple calculations we've seen in the past, there's a lot of big variables out there that are still at play.
Yeah, as we like to say 1,500 times a day, it's unprecedented times, and that will apply in this case as well. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the discussion this evening. Thank you so much to David Hurley, Jenny Byrne, Emily Nicola, and Andrew Thompson. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.